It began on a quiet Tuesday morning in a suburban neighborhood that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. The kind of place where freshly mown lawns, pastel-colored mailboxes, and beige stucco homes painted a picture of tranquility. But as many homeowners would eventually discover, appearances could be deceiving. My street had a rhythm, a predictable ebb and flow of activity. The school bus came at 7:30 sharp. The mail carrier walked the same route every afternoon, and neighbors tended to their gardens like clockwork. I had lived there for 5 years without incident, maintaining my property meticulously, planting seasonal flowers in neat beds, and occasionally nodding to familiar faces during my morning coffee runs. Until the driveway incident. That morning, I had woken early, determined to reorganize my garage and move my car to a spot that made access to the yard more convenient. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would raise eyebrows, just a normal homeowner task. The sun was low, casting a soft golden hue over the neighborhood, and I was humming to myself as I pulled my car forward, intending to temporarily block my own driveway while I shifted a stack of boxes. It seemed simple enough. Unbeknownst to me, this act would trigger the chain of events that transformed a mundane morning into an ordeal that would involve law enforcement, neighborly confrontation, and a summons I never expected. My car sat half in the driveway, half on the curb, a small, temporary obstruction. I assumed the situation was obvious to anyone passing by. My own property, my own car, my own responsibility. But, as is often the case in these neighborhood dramas, perception and reality rarely aligned. The first hint that things were about to escalate came when I noticed a neighbor across the street observing me intently. She was well-dressed, immaculate as always, a person whose attention to detail extended beyond her own property. She had earned a reputation in the neighborhood, not for friendliness or warmth, but for an unwavering vigilance over the rules, whether they were HOA regulations, city codes, or her own personal interpretations thereof. This was Karen, though no one called her that aloud. Everyone knew her as the woman who never let anything slip through the cracks. At first, I paid her little mind. People watch, people judge. I was used to it. But she didn't simply watch. Within minutes, she had stormed down the street, heels clicking sharply against the pavement, phone in hand. It was a purposeful march, the kind that left no doubt she had a mission, and the direction was clear, toward my driveway. By the time she arrived, I had finished moving one stack of boxes and was preparing to drive my car back into its usual spot. She didn't wait for an explanation or a casual greeting. Instead, she launched immediately into action, snapping photos, gesturing toward my car, and waving her phone as if she had already dialed someone. In her mind, she had likely caught a violation in progress, a blatant affront to neighborhood standards, a moment that demanded official intervention. I tried to reason with her, waving my hands and pointing out that it was my own driveway and my own car, that this was temporary, that no other vehicles were impeded. She paused briefly, then shook her head, muttering something I couldn't quite hear, her expression a mixture of disbelief and righteous indignation. Her phone stayed up, capturing angles, close-ups, perhaps even documenting the sunlight hitting my vehicle just wrong. It was as if she were assembling evidence for a trial that hadn't yet been called. Moments later, the unmistakable wail of a siren pierced the calm suburban air. A police cruiser turned the corner with lights flashing. The sight of it made my stomach knot. I had dealt with traffic stops and minor incidents before, but never this, being reported for blocking my own driveway. An officer stepped out, a composed figure in a crisp uniform, and began to approach. I greeted him, explained the situation succinctly, but the presence of the neighbor and her phone complicated the narrative. Karen was adamant, pointing and speaking quickly, her words a rapid-fire stream of accusations, obstruction, violation, irresponsibility. I showed the officer the context, the boxes, the temporary placement, the fact that this was my property. He listened politely, jotting down notes, but the neighbor's insistence created tension. What was intended for a 5-minute chore had become an escalated scenario that now involved law enforcement. Even as I moved my car to unblock the driveway, the officer remained, partly out of caution, partly to document the neighbor's complaints. The encounter was awkward, a dance of civility and assertion. After what felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, the officer thanked me for my cooperation and left, leaving Karen standing there with her phone. She wasn't satisfied. Her attention was unrelenting, her determination unshaken. In her mind, she had not just reported an infraction, she had delivered justice. But in the aftermath, a new complication arose. Days later, I received a formal notice, a summons to my command office, not for a parking violation, but for a review related to neighborhood conduct and reported disturbances. Apparently, my temporary driveway blockage combined with Karen's documentation had triggered a bureaucratic escalation I hadn't anticipated. The notice was official, stamped and sealed. The language was precise, outlining the time, location, and expectations. Reading it, I felt a mix of disbelief and mounting concern. How had a simple, routine task spiraled into something requiring formal proceedings? My mind raced through the events, retracing the steps, the gestures, the photos, and the unexpected persistence of my neighbor. It seemed surreal, almost cinematic, as if my morning had been a prelude to an entirely new story in the world of suburban oversight and vigilant neighbors. And so, what began as a minor inconvenience, a momentary obstruction in my own driveway, had evolved into a pending summons, the first chapter of a confrontation I didn't ask for, but was now undeniably part of my life. The stage was set for something far larger than a single car, a single driveway, or a single complaint. The neighborhood had rules, yes, but sometimes it seemed the enforcers of those rules had their own narratives that could intersect with your life in ways you never expected. With the official notice in hand, and the day stretching ahead, I realized this was only the beginning. What seemed like a trivial, isolated incident was about to grow, expand, and involve layers of bureaucracy, community tension, and the kind of scrutiny that makes even mundane suburban life feel like a high-stakes drama. I was about to step into a world I hadn't chosen, yet could not ignore. And as I looked out my window toward the familiar street, I knew one thing. The Karen from across the road was not finished, not by a long shot. The day ended with a quiet tension, a neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, but under the surface, a storm was brewing. The driveway, once a simple, functional space, had become a symbol of control, a flashpoint for conflict, and a catalyst for what would unfold next. The summons awaited, and with it, a confrontation I couldn't yet fully imagine.
The envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a silent harbinger. Its weight was heavier than any piece of paper should feel, stamped with the insignia of authority and printed in a tone that brooked no argument. Summonses rarely arrive for trivial infractions, and yet here it was, my name, my address, and a time I was expected to appear at the command office. The words felt surreal, almost theatrical, as if I had wandered unwittingly into a drama meant for someone else. The driveway incident, fleeting and mundane in my mind, had officially crossed into officialdom. For the next few days, a strange combination of anxiety and anticipation settled over me. Every sound outside my home, the snap of a branch in the wind, the hum of passing cars, the distant bark of a dog seemed loaded with meaning. I found myself glancing toward my street, half expecting Karen to appear at any moment, phone in hand, ready to document my next move. Her presence, once a mere annoyance, had now transformed into a psychological weight. I felt watched, evaluated, and preemptively judged, all without a single word exchanged between us. The neighborhood itself seemed altered. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still painted in cheerful shades, but every routine gesture, a jogger crossing the street, a neighbor walking their dog, was subtly tense, as if everyone were aware of the incident and waiting to see how it would unfold. I realized that in these communities, drama has a ripple effect. One small spark, one temporary blocked driveway, could ripple outward, affecting not just those directly involved, but an entire ecosystem of suburban observers. I tried to maintain normalcy. Coffee in the morning, a run to the corner store, a brief chat with neighbors who hadn't yet been infected by the tension. Yet my own behavior betrayed me. I found myself avoiding the driveway, moving cars earlier than necessary, and even hesitating before taking out the trash, worried that any action might be misinterpreted. The summons had shifted the balance. I was now hyper-aware, acutely conscious of how easily ordinary life could become extraordinary under the gaze of someone determined to enforce rules. Meanwhile, Karen's activity did not abate. She was visible more often than before, seemingly performing an unspoken patrol. At times, she would appear at the end of her driveway, leaning slightly forward, phone in hand, eyes scanning the neighborhood as though she were collecting data for a private investigation. At first, I thought it coincidental, but over time, the pattern became unmistakable. Her watchfulness was calculated, methodical, and designed to provoke a heightened sense of self-surveillance. Every glance felt like a subtle warning. The next infraction could be worse than a simple complaint. I began documenting everything: notes, photos, timestamps, an ironic echo of Karen's own obsessive recording. I told myself it was for my own protection, a way to establish a factual timeline should the situation escalate. Yet there was an unspoken tension in doing so, a feeling of being drawn into the very behavior I had once observed with mild amusement. The lines between neighborly caution and paranoia were blurring. When the day of the summons finally arrived, I felt a nervous anticipation that bordered on dread. I drove to the command office early, parking at a respectful distance, trying to appear calm and cooperative. The building itself was unremarkable: beige concrete, large glass doors, and a handful of official vehicles parked out front. Yet inside, it radiated a sense of authority, a reminder that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute, but a matter now acknowledged by a higher power. The waiting area was filled with people, some seated quietly, others engaged in hushed conversations. There was a subtle hierarchy, an unspoken understanding of who belonged and who was there under scrutiny. As I took a seat, I noticed other faces, each reflecting varying levels of apprehension, indignation, or resignation. Some appeared to be in positions of authority, while others seemed caught up in administrative crossfires, much like I now was. The air was charged with expectation, a quiet tension that seemed to vibrate beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. Eventually, a clerk called my name. The walk through the office was slow, deliberate, each step echoing off the linoleum floors. My mind raced with possibilities. Would this be a formal reprimand, a lecture on neighborhood decorum, or would it be more subtle, a review, a negotiation, a chance to assert control over my own narrative? Every instinct told me that the outcome was uncertain, that in matters of bureaucracy, appearances and narratives could matter more than facts. Inside the office, I was greeted by an officer who, while professional, carried an unmistakable air of procedural authority. He asked me to recount the events surrounding the driveway incident, prompting me to provide context, timelines, and intent. I explained everything with as much clarity and calm as possible: the temporary blocking of my own driveway, the movement of boxes, and my assumption that no violation had occurred. I presented my documentation, photographs of the driveway before, during, and after the incident, and notes that outlined the sequence of events. Yet even as I spoke, it became clear that the situation had already developed a life of its own. Karen's documentation had established a narrative, one in which I appeared negligent, obstructive, and resistant to community standards. The officer's expression was neutral, but the subtle weight of the paperwork in front of him and the careful phrasing of questions hinted that my side, while noted, might not carry the same authority as the evidence provided by the neighbor. It was a strange inversion. The person who had created the problem from a place of rigid enforcement seemed to hold more influence than the person whose property was at stake. After what felt like hours, but was likely less than 30 minutes, the officer concluded the session. He explained that the report would be reviewed, that my cooperation was noted, and that further action might be taken depending on the outcome of internal discussions. The language was polite, but it carried a subtle warning. The neighborhood's scrutiny did not end at the boundaries of my driveway, and my actions, however innocent, were now part of a documented history. Returning home, the weight of the summons lingered. The driveway no longer felt like a mere access point for vehicles. It had become a symbol of oversight, a stage upon which disputes over control, perception, and community standards played out. By the evening, I found myself back at my window watching the street bathed in the soft glow of sunset. Karen was nowhere to be seen, but her influence lingered. The house across the street appeared quiet, but I knew that tomorrow could bring her back armed with her phone and her sense of mission. I realized that in this neighborhood, peace was conditional, and normalcy was fragile. Every action, every movement carried potential consequence. The first chapter of the official proceedings had ended, but the story was far from over. The summons was not merely a bureaucratic formality. It was an invitation into a deeper, more complex engagement with the neighborhood, a challenge to navigate the unspoken rules and the vigilant eyes of those who believed in absolute adherence to their own vision of order. And as darkness fell over the street, I knew that the next chapter was already in motion, that the true escalation had yet to begin, and that the delicate balance of suburban life could shift in the blink of an eye.
The days following my visit to the command office were a peculiar mixture of relief and tension. On one hand, the formal meeting had concluded without immediate penalties or fines. On the other hand, a subtle but unmistakable sense of scrutiny had settled over my home like a thin layer of frost. Every movement outside, every car pulled into the driveway, every package left on the porch seemed magnified under the imaginary lens of surveillance. Karen, now more than ever, occupied the center of this lens, her presence both literal and psychological. It was a Saturday morning when the real escalation began. I had stepped outside to water my flower beds, a mundane weekend task, when I noticed an unfamiliar figure in the distance, clipboard in hand, moving deliberately from house to house. Their gait was purposeful, authoritative, and completely detached from the casual weekend rituals of joggers or dog walkers. As they approached my home, I immediately recognized the insignia of the HOA. The Homeowners Association, once a peripheral presence in the neighborhood, quietly sending newsletters or reminders, had arrived with a mission, and judging by the clipboard and their meticulous note-taking, it was not a friendly visit. The HOA representative circled my property as if cataloging every detail, from the alignment of the mailbox to the angle of the garden gnome on the lawn. I had maintained my home meticulously, but I also knew that perfection was never enough when someone had a checklist and an agenda. Every little deviation, whether a stray leaf, a slightly crooked welcome mat, or a tire mark on the driveway, was potential fodder. The experience was disorienting. I had expected neighbors to gossip or complain. I had not expected an organized, formalized audit that could weigh against me in a documented fashion. As the representative completed his inspection, he noted minor infractions, a slightly overgrown hedge, a few weeds creeping along the walkway, and a small crack in the driveway. Each observation, while trivial, was recorded in a neat, systematic manner, ready to be compiled into a report. I realized that in the context of this neighborhood, minor imperfections were amplified into evidence of negligence or disregard for communal standards. The driveway incident had been a spark. The HOA's presence was now a tinderbox waiting for any misstep to ignite a formal escalation. Karen, of course, was never far from the narrative. I noticed her leaning slightly out of her window, phone in hand, observing the HOA's actions with an intensity that suggested she had orchestrated this visit behind the scenes. Whether or not she had, I could not confirm, but her timing was impeccable and her satisfaction palpable. She had shifted from vigilant neighbor to indirect architect of oversight, and I had become the subject of a scrutiny network I didn't ask to join. By the end of the inspection, the representative left, promising that a written report would follow and that further meetings might be required. The report arrived a few days later, formal in tone, listing each minor infraction alongside recommendations for compliance. It was clear that the HOA, like Karen, viewed my actions and property through a lens of rigid expectation. The driveway incident, while noted as resolved, had placed me on a figurative watch list, a designation that ensured every future action would be filtered through suspicion. In the meantime, my own routine began to change under this heightened awareness. I approached gardening with precision, measuring plant spacing and trimming edges with surgical care. I aligned my cars in exact spots, photographing each arrangement for my records. The psychological weight was tangible. The neighborhood, once familiar and predictable, now felt like a stage, with every homeowner's movement potentially observed, recorded, and judged. Even simple tasks like retrieving the mail or walking the dog became exercises in careful choreography. Karen's influence continued to expand. She began attending HOA meetings regularly, her reports and observations gaining attention and credibility among the board members. It became apparent that she had not merely complained about a driveway, but had initiated a form of neighborhood governance in which her interpretations of rules held weight. I could sense that my position as a homeowner, once autonomous and independent, was gradually being eroded, replaced by a reality where adherence to her standards dictated the rhythm of life. Then, the inevitable happened. I received a notice from the HOA requesting a formal meeting regarding compliance concerns and community standards. The letter was polite, but the subtext was unmistakable. My conduct, my property, and my interactions with neighbors were now officially under review. It was an escalation beyond the police summons, beyond casual observation, a formal, structured confrontation designed to assert authority and redefine boundaries. The meeting itself was a carefully orchestrated exercise in procedural drama. I arrived at the HOA office, greeted by the familiar clipboard, folders, and a panel of board members who wore expressions of measured authority. Each member had read Karen's reports and reviewed the documentation from my driveway incident. The discussion was entirely narrative-driven. Facts were recounted, timelines reiterated, and interpretations debated, all without a single raised voice, but with an intensity that felt suffocating. Every word, every gesture, every attempt to explain context was measured against a pre-existing narrative constructed by my neighbor and corroborated by HOA standards. By the time I left the meeting, it was clear that the situation had shifted permanently. My actions were no longer private, my property no longer entirely my own, and the concept of ordinary life, watering plants, moving a car, unloading boxes, had transformed into an exercise in compliance. Karen's influence had extended into institutional authority. Her narrative merged with formal oversight, and I was left navigating the tension between autonomy and external scrutiny. Returning home, I realized that the street itself had changed in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Neighbors who had once been casual acquaintances now walked with heightened awareness, aware that the HOA was active and that violations, real or perceived, carried consequences. My driveway, the origin of this drama, was no longer a functional space. It had become a symbol of oversight, a touchpoint for conflict, and a reminder that in this neighborhood, even minor actions could spiral into elaborate confrontations. As night fell, I stood by my window, looking out across the quiet street. Karen's house was dark, but I could almost feel her presence, the lingering gaze of vigilance that had orchestrated much of this escalation. The HOA's actions had confirmed a new reality. The neighborhood operated on rules that were selectively enforced, influenced heavily by one determined individual, and my life had become entwined in a cycle of observation, documentation, and potential confrontation. The first two chapters, police involvement and official scrutiny, had set the stage. Now the HOA had expanded the battlefield, and I understood that the true drama was just beginning. Every future movement, every small decision would be influenced by the awareness that one neighbor's vigilance could ripple through layers of authority, shaping perception and consequences in ways I could not yet fully predict. The stage was set for the next act, a deeper, more complex engagement with control, compliance, and the relentless pursuit of perceived order. And as I turned away from the window, the quiet hum of the neighborhood at dusk belied the storm that was gathering just beyond the manicured lawns.
After the HOA meeting, life on the street transformed into something surreal, a slow-motion game of observation, inference, and subtle intimidation. My daily routines, once ordinary and private, became fraught with tension. Even simple acts, taking out the trash, watering plants, adjusting the mailbox flag, felt like performances under a hidden audience. The driveway incident had long passed, yet its shadow persisted, amplified by Karen's relentless vigilance and the HOA's implicit enforcement. It began subtly. At first, it was the feeling of being watched, a flicker of movement behind drawn curtains, a car parked unusually long near my house, a neighbor's gaze lingering too long as they passed. Then came the signs that the observation was not passive. I noticed small changes around my property, subtle shifts in the position of garden tools, a misplaced doormat, footprints in the mulch where none should have been. Nothing overt, nothing illegal in the legal sense, yet enough to unsettle, to make me question whether I was alone on my own property. Karen was at the center of it, though indirectly. Her presence was pervasive. She appeared more frequently outside, phone in hand, documenting everything, from the precise angle of my car to the alignment of my hedge. Sometimes I would catch her on video call with neighbors, gesturing and whispering, as though orchestrating a network of surveillance. I realized that this wasn't just personal obsession. It was a coordinated effort to monitor, record, and ultimately influence behavior. The HOA, of course, remained an instrument of control. They had begun issuing increasingly specific advisories, referencing prior incidents and potential non-compliance. Each notice was a carefully worded reminder that my actions were under review, that minor oversights could be interpreted as patterns of negligence. The line between minor imperfection and formal violation blurred, leaving me in a constant state of uncertainty. Even my friends who visited noted the palpable tension, the way neighbors seemed to pause and observe interactions, as if auditing the social fabric of the street itself. Then came the escalation. It was a Thursday morning when I discovered my mailbox had been tampered with. Letters were slightly bent, flyers rearranged, and one small package, clearly marked for delivery to me, had been nudged several feet down the curb. Nothing destructive, nothing criminal in the legal sense, but enough to send a chilling message. Someone was not just observing, someone was interfering. The pattern was unmistakable. The driveway incident had ignited more than just complaints. It had activated a network of neighborhood control. I began to document everything more rigorously. Timestamps, photos, video recordings, and logs of every interaction with neighbors and HOA representatives. I tried to anticipate every possible interpretation of my actions, as if each choice, how I parked, when I left the house, even how I arranged my garden, could be scrutinized, reported, and used against me. Living under this degree of surveillance was exhausting, mentally and emotionally. The lines between reality and paranoia blurred, yet the evidence of external manipulation made it difficult to dismiss the feeling. Karen, as always, was the nucleus of this network. She seemed to thrive on the tension, her presence a constant, silent assertion of authority. It was not confrontation in the conventional sense. There were no loud arguments or public disputes. Instead, it was the subtle, strategic orchestration of influence, a slow-moving psychological campaign designed to unsettle and control. Every HOA notice, every observed infraction, every small interference with my property became a thread in a larger tapestry of social power. Then came the turning point. An anonymous note slipped under my door, neatly typed with precise instructions and warnings. It referenced past incidents, implied knowledge of my routines, and subtly warned of consequences should the patterns continue. The anonymity did not hide the truth. It was an extension of the same surveillance network operating under the guise of civility but carrying unmistakable undertones of intimidation. The driveway incident had grown into a full-fledged conflict, a war over autonomy and control conducted under the pretense of community standards. Faced with this, I realized that traditional confrontation was not sufficient. Karen's influence, the HOA's oversight, and the subtle sabotage required a new strategy. I began to compile evidence, creating a detailed record of every incident, every interference, and every communication with neighbors and HOA representatives. What had begun as a minor driveway mishap had now evolved into a complex narrative of control and harassment, one that required careful navigation to avoid escalating further while protecting my rights and autonomy. Even as I meticulously documented everything, I noticed changes in my own behavior. I avoided unnecessary interactions with neighbors, altered my schedule to minimize observation, and reconsidered even routine home maintenance tasks. My house, once a sanctuary, had become a stage, and I was performing under invisible scrutiny. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves, every opening of a door carried significance. Ordinary life had been transformed into a theater of vigilance, and the driveway, a seemingly innocuous stretch of concrete, remained the symbolic battlefield of this conflict. By the weekend, the tension reached its peak. Karen appeared at the street corner, phone in hand, speaking to someone on a call, while another neighbor lingered just out of sight, seemingly observing my movements. The HOA had issued a new advisory, referencing prior incidents and suggesting increased community awareness. It was clear that the network of surveillance and subtle intimidation was not only intact but expanding. But amidst this tension, a strange clarity emerged. I understood that the driveway incident, the summons, the HOA meetings, and the ongoing surveillance were not isolated events. They were part of a larger pattern, a system of control designed to assert dominance over individual autonomy within the neighborhood. Recognizing this allowed me to plan, to strategize, and to begin reclaiming agency even as the pressure continued to mount. The night settled over the street, quiet and deceptively calm, masking the undercurrents of control, observation, and subtle sabotage. The driveway, once a functional entryway, had become the symbolic epicenter of a conflict that extended far beyond its concrete boundaries. The neighborhood, a stage for vigilance and influence, had revealed the depth of its network, and the battle lines were now unmistakably drawn. As I stood by the window, reviewing the day's recordings and notes, I realized that this was not just about property or compliance. It was about power, perception, and control, a complex, escalating drama that had ensnared an entire street. The next steps would require careful maneuvering, strategic documentation, and an unwavering focus on maintaining both composure and autonomy. The stage was set for confrontation, and the subtle war over the driveway and over the balance of power in the neighborhood was far from over.
The weeks following the surveillance incidents had turned life into a series of calculated movements. Each morning began with a careful scan of the street. Each outdoor chore became an exercise in strategic timing, and every interaction, however brief, was approached with a mental checklist. Karen's presence, the HOA's influence, and the subtle acts of interference had created a sense of constant tension, like walking a tightrope across a stage where the audience was both unseen and omnipresent. Then came the notice, a formal HOA hearing scheduled at the community clubhouse for review of compliance concerns, neighborhood conduct, and prior documented incidents. The letter was polite but unmistakably serious. It referenced past events, including the driveway blockage and minor landscaping issues, and implied that failure to demonstrate compliance could result in fines, restrictions, or other formal actions. This was no longer a suggestion. It was an official confrontation, a public examination of behavior and property that I had previously navigated privately. The day of the hearing arrived. I approached the clubhouse with a sense of grim determination, parking strategically at the edge of the lot, surveying the other attendees. Neighbors were gathered, some whispering in small clusters, others sitting quietly, reviewing notes or checking phones. Karen arrived shortly after, flawless as always, carrying herself with an air of authority that suggested she had already won the moral high ground. Her presence set the tone. The HOA's process was not just procedural, it was performative, a stage for the assertion of influence and control. Inside, the room was arranged formally, a long table separating the board members from attendees. The board itself consisted of 5 individuals, each reviewing their folders and digital devices, their expressions neutral but attentive. My heart raced as I realized the scope of what was about to unfold. The documents Karen had submitted, combined with prior HOA notes and my own past incidents, formed a narrative that had already been constructed. My role was to respond, to defend, and to assert context, all under the scrutinizing eyes of neighbors who were, in many ways, invested in the drama. The hearing began with procedural statements, introductions, summaries of past incidents, and a review of documentation. Karen's reports were highlighted repeatedly, photographs of my driveway, notes on minor landscaping imperfections, and references to prior complaints that had been escalated. The language was formal but pointed, each phrase chosen to frame my actions as neglectful or non-compliant, reinforcing the perception that the incident was symptomatic of a broader disregard for community standards. When my turn to speak came, I presented my documentation methodically. Photographs showing the driveway before, during, and after the temporary blockage. Notes outlining my timeline of actions, and evidence of prior compliance with HOA rules. I emphasized context, intent, and the temporary nature of the incident, highlighting the absurdity of escalating a personal driveway maneuver into a formal dispute. Every point was counterbalanced against Karen's meticulous records, and every assertion was scrutinized by the board, who nodded, jotted notes, and occasionally exchanged glances that suggested the final judgment had already been influenced by the narrative they had received. The tension in the room was palpable. Neighbors leaned forward subtly, their attention intense yet silent. Karen, poised and self-assured, did not speak directly to me, yet her presence dominated the space. The board's questions were precise, their tone neutral, yet carried the weight of authority. Each inquiry required careful phrasing and measured responses, a balancing act between defending my actions and avoiding any appearance of hostility or non-compliance. After what felt like an eternity, the board concluded the formal review portion of the hearing. They recessed to deliberate privately, while Karen and other observers lingered in the room. During this time, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Conversations were hushed, movements deliberate, and every glance toward me felt loaded with judgment. The subtle psychology of the situation became clear. The process itself was designed to amplify stress, to create a sense of vulnerability, and to reinforce the authority of those who had already constructed the narrative. When the board returned, their decision was announced. A formal warning would be issued regarding minor compliance issues, including the driveway incident and landscaping imperfections, with the note that future infractions could lead to fines or restrictions. The warning was framed as corrective rather than punitive, but the subtext was undeniable. My behavior had been evaluated, judged, and placed under scrutiny. Karen's influence had been validated indirectly, and the neighborhood had collectively witnessed the assertion of oversight. As I left the hearing, the weight of the experience settled over me. The driveway incident, the surveillance, the HOA documentation, and Karen's vigilance had culminated in a formal statement of authority, a symbolic assertion of control over private property and personal autonomy. Yet amid this tension, a sense of clarity emerged. While the process had been uncomfortable, it had also illuminated the mechanisms by which influence, observation, and narrative operate in tightly controlled communities. Back at home, I began reflecting on the series of events. Each stage, the police involvement, the summons, the HOA inspections, the surveillance, and the hearing itself, was part of a continuum, a progression that highlighted how minor actions could escalate under the influence of persistent vigilance and formal authority. The driveway had been the catalyst, but the real issue was not the concrete itself. It was perception,
narrative, and the willingness of a single individual to mobilize institutional structures to assert dominance. As evening fell over the street, I stood at my driveway, the origin of the entire saga, and reflected on the journey. What had begun as a simple, temporary blockage of my own driveway had evolved into a complex drama of surveillance, institutional oversight, and neighborhood politics. The resolution of the HOA hearing did not erase the tension or undo the psychological impact, but it did provide a framework for understanding, planning, and navigating the intricate landscape of suburban oversight. The stage was set for the final chapter, where consequences, resolution, and personal clarity would converge. The driveway, once a mundane feature of daily life, had become a symbol of vigilance, conflict, and the delicate balance between personal autonomy and collective scrutiny.
The weeks following the HOA hearing brought a cautious calm to the neighborhood. The formal warning had been issued, the documentation had been filed, and the psychological intensity that had defined the prior months began to ease, at least superficially. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions persisted, like ripples across a pond long after a stone has sunk. The driveway, once a mundane fixture of suburban life, now carried symbolic weight, a reminder of the intricate interplay between personal autonomy and communal scrutiny. Life slowly resumed its routines, but with an acute awareness that everything I did was observed, evaluated, and potentially recorded. I continued documenting activities around the property, not out of fear alone, but as a form of preparation, a strategy to reclaim agency. Every photograph, every timestamp, every note became part of a larger framework, a buffer against future escalations, and an assertion of my right to context and clarity. The balance between vigilance and normalcy was delicate, requiring constant attention, yet it became a form of empowerment in its own right. Karen's presence, while still noticeable, shifted subtly. She continued her observational habits, but the formal warning had tempered some of her influence. Her documentation was no longer automatically validated by institutional authority, and her role as arbiter of neighborhood standards was slightly diminished. It was a nuanced change, almost imperceptible to casual observers, but significant for those directly involved in the conflict. Her vigilance persisted, yet it now existed within a framework that recognized limits, boundaries, and accountability. The HOA, too, adjusted its approach. Follow-up inspections became less frequent, and notices were framed more constructively rather than as implicit threats. The community had witnessed the escalation, the procedural review, and the resolution, and there was an unspoken understanding that minor conflicts could no longer be amplified without context or justification. The formal structures of oversight remained, but they now existed alongside a clearer delineation of fairness and procedure. I, for my part, reflected deeply on the experience. The driveway incident, a seemingly trivial matter, had acted as a catalyst, exposing the mechanisms by which perception, narrative, and influence could converge to shape reality. It revealed how minor actions, when viewed through the lens of vigilant observation and institutional authority, could escalate into complex social and bureaucratic dramas. More importantly, it highlighted the importance of documentation, context, and measured response when navigating such environments. Interactions with neighbors returned to a semblance of normalcy, though they were subtly altered by the recent events. Casual greetings were accompanied by a shared understanding that boundaries had shifted, that autonomy carried responsibility, and that vigilance was an accepted part of neighborhood life. Karen, while still present and observant, became one among many, her influence now tempered by the processes and experiences that had unfolded. The street regained its rhythm, its patterns familiar yet permanently marked by the prior months of scrutiny and conflict. The driveway itself returned to its intended purpose, a functional space for vehicles, a point of access to the home, and a reminder of the saga that had unfolded. Every time I parked my car, I was conscious of the past events, yet also aware of the resilience and agency I had reclaimed. The concrete, the borders of the property, and the physical space were no longer just functional. They were symbolic markers of autonomy, vigilance, and the subtle balance of power within a community. In the evenings, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of the experience. Communities, I realized, are defined not only by their physical structures, but by the narratives, expectations, and interpersonal dynamics that shape daily life. Rules and standards exist, yes, but the interpretation and enforcement of those rules can create tension, challenge autonomy, and test patience. The experience illuminated the fragile line between order and overreach, between vigilance and intrusion, and between conflict and resolution. Ultimately, the driveway incident became a story of adaptation, resilience, and awareness. I had navigated police involvement, HOA scrutiny, neighbor surveillance, and institutional processes, emerging with both insight and a renewed understanding of boundaries. Karen, while persistent, had revealed the limits of influence when balanced against documentation, clarity, and measured response. The neighborhood had shifted subtly, a landscape now marked by the echoes of oversight, but also by the capacity for fairness, resolution, and coexistence. As night fell, I stood once more by the driveway, gazing across the quiet street. The homes glowed softly in the lamplight, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the neighborhood, once a stage of subtle conflict, now carried the calm of restored equilibrium. The driveway, my car, and the garden were once again mine to manage, under the watchful but bounded eyes of neighbors and the HOA. What had begun as a simple, temporary obstruction had grown into a multi-layered experience of social dynamics, authority, and personal resilience. In the end, life continued, shaped but not defined by the events of the past months. The story of the driveway, the police involvement, the HOA scrutiny, and Karen's vigilance had concluded not with grand confrontation, but with careful navigation, strategic documentation, and the quiet assertion of personal autonomy. The neighborhood remained a community, with all its rules, personalities, and expectations intact, yet the balance of oversight and independence had been clarified, leaving space for both vigilance and ordinary life to coexist. And so the saga closed where it began, in a quiet suburban street with a driveway that was no longer merely a driveway, but a symbol of endurance, observation, and the subtle art of surviving and thriving in a neighborhood defined by scrutiny, standards, and the occasionally overzealous watchfulness of one determined neighbor.